All right. Are we on the same page, literally?
Yeah, you can advance one more slide.
Okay.
There we go.
All right. So Ray and I were in agreement on the first four insects. The fifth one we had a little disagreement over, but we played paper, rock, scissors, and I won. And so the honeybee, Western honeybee, is the fifth insect. If we had chosen six, there would have been bloodshed. And so we decided to stop at five. These are the five we chose. The first of them being the domestic silk moth in the upper left, oriental rat flea in the top center, the human body louse in the bottom left, yellow fever mosquito Aedes aegypti in the center bottom, and the Western honeybee that you all know well in the bottom right. And so the presentation, I'll go through each of these in very little detail. I could give a seminar on each one of them for a full hour, but I'll go through all of them, and I'll talk a little bit about honeybees and hopefully some things that maybe you don't know. But I'm going to start with talking about silk and what is this thing that is called silk. And many of you have silk, whether it's a necktie or a dress or a slip or something, but it's absolutely glamorous, beautiful. But silk is just moth spit. And I don't mean silk is made from moth spit. Silk is moth spit. It's two proteins that are secreted in the saliva from the caterpillar of the silkworm moth, this being the adult silkworm moth. And the caterpillar secretes these two proteins that are produced in the salivary glands, and this drawing illustrating the salivary glands, the spinnerets at the top where the silk emerges, and these tubes, the glands, and you see how convoluted they are. And if you were to dissect these from the caterpillar, and the caterpillar can get to about 2 inches or so, if you were to dissect these, stretch them out lengthwise, they would measure 10 times the length of the caterpillar. So for a 2-inch caterpillar, you're talking 20 inches of salivary glands, and they make up about half of the caterpillar's weight. So these caterpillars have one pair of salivary glands. They make up half of their weight. Humans have 3 pairs of salivary glands, and we can be grateful that they don't make up 50% of our weight. They make about 0.1% of our body weight, half the caterpillar's weight. So as you might imagine, pretty important to the caterpillars. And when the caterpillar is just about finished developing, stops feeding and begins spinning a cocoon, and it moves its mouth parts back and forth, and from the spinnerets, this single strand of 2 proteins stuck together. One is a very sticky protein, making a single strand of silk. And the entire caterpillar is made from one strand of silk. It's not multiple pieces put together. If you were to extract this and move it or make it as one long strand, it would measure almost 0.6 of a mile, or just over 0.6 of a mile of one strand of silk, thinner than a human hair. And it's been said that for its weight, silk is as strong as steel. I've never measured that. I don't know that. You don't see very many suspension bridges made out of silk, but I suppose you could because of its strength. So what? Who cares? Why do I make a big deal out of silk? Well, it's been around for who knows how long, probably at least 7,000 years. And in ancient times, silk was worth its weight in gold. It was used as a currency. The Chinese used it paying debts. They paid soldiers in silk. It was even the payment made in an elaborate extortion plot that went on between one of the warring tribes in Western China and the emperor. And I won't go into the detail, it's in the book. But silk was the payment for that extortion plot. But probably most important was silk led to really the beginning, large-scale beginning of trade. And that was along what's known as the Silk Roads. Maybe you've heard the term the Silk Road. It's not a singular term at all. It's plural because the Silk Roads, not one single road, but an intersecting web of a number of different routes that stretch from the city of Xi'an in eastern China all the way to what at early days known as Constantinople. We know it now as Istanbul in Turkey, and extensions that went to the Arabian Sea and Karachi, that's now in Pakistan, to the South China Sea, and a number of other routes. But this web, or this series of routes, stretched for 4,000 miles. And it lasted for nearly 2,000 years as an important route of trade. And because of these intersecting routes, wherever the roads came together, trading occurred. And when goods were moved east and west, nothing went with a single trader the entire length. It was carried to the next town and then offloaded, traded, and then somebody else took it on further. So it was almost like a relay race. But where these routes intersected, there were trade centers that emerged, and these were markets, and those markets became cities. And the cities that were important in ancient times, the city of Samarkand in what's now Uzbekistan, Baghdad in now Iraq, Merv, which was decimated by the Mongols. I don't remember the year, but basically nothing left now. The city of Kaffa that's on the Black Sea, actually fairly close to where some of the fighting between the Ukraine and Russia is going on now. And so the Silk Roads developed these, or were the reason for development of these cities, these trade cities. But the routes were important for moving goods, but probably even more important because of the movement of technology and languages, ideas, different religions, exposures of people to others. And so was really important in early history of humankind, and did so for almost 2,000 years. Because of the production of silk in the Chinese empires, a significant amount of wealth. And as I say, the movement of products and technology, I won't read all these, you can read faster than I can speak, but a couple of them important. Gunpowder going from China to the West, or paper. The wheel from the West to the East that had not been known in China until it had been moved along the Silk Roads. Gold coins from the Mediterranean being moved around. And so the movement of goods, the movement of technology and of ideas. So the importance of the Silk Roads. And I'm gonna, at the very end of the talk, I'll have a story about silk to go with this. But the Silk Roads, not only the routes of trade, but they were routes of death. Because the desert, and I have the two right arrows on the right-hand side, orange arrows, pointing out the Gobi and the Taklamakan deserts, which were the ancestral home, and actually still, of the bubonic plague. And the plague was moved along these Silk Roads in early history. The arrow on the left side is pointing out Kaffa on the Black Sea, and Kaffa will be important in a moment. And so the plague was moved and carried along the Silk Roads by the oriental rat flea, one of our insects, and you see it on the right-hand side here. The host of those fleas were gerbils, and they're not the little fuzzy pets like maybe your children had or my children had, but these were large, giant gerbils, about 8 or 9 inches long, pretty heavy. And their home in this high desert of Asia where they were the host of these fleas. And those fleas later infested rats, and they were carried along the Silk Roads. And three significant times in history led to three different pandemics of the bubonic plague. The first of these in the middle 500s AD, lasting about 200 years, it was known as the Justinian plague, and it's thought to have killed somewhere 30 to 50 million people. The numbers are in question just because there wasn't very great detailed documentation, but at least putting together from some writings the estimate that people have come up with. And we'll use it for this purpose for today. That was the first pandemic. About 800 years later, the second pandemic, and this one lasted a long time, better than 300 years. And this one was better documented and thought to have killed somewhere around 100 million people. That's about a quarter of all the people that were alive on Earth at that time, or at least that were known to have been alive. And as part of that, there was just a very short period, 4 to 5 year period, that was called the Black Death. And the Black Death was not synonymous with the plague or with the pandemic, but really only a short time period or a subset of those years. And then the third pandemic, much more recent, middle 1800s to the middle 1900s, about 15 million deaths, primarily in India. But this one was global because at that point there were routes by sea and trade occurring. And so the plague was carried pretty well around the world. And it's that third pandemic that was the beginning of the story of the plague being rats and fleas. And during the second pandemic, when the Black Death occurred, an epidemic began, this in Mongolia, the high desert, in the early 1300s. It was carried by the Mongols as they moved westward, and they laid siege to that city of Kaffa that I pointed out on the map. Well, there's a story, it's apocryphal, but allegedly the Mongols got rid of their dead who were dying from the plague by catapulting them into this city of Kaffa that they had under siege. And I mean, it's almost certainly not true, but it makes for great visual imagery, and it sounds like something that would have been in a Monty Python film. However, it occurred, an epidemic did occur in the city of Kaffa, and it was largely populated by merchants from the city of Genoa in Italy. And so those that were able to get out of Kaffa did so, fleeing by across the Black Sea, but inadvertently they took the plague with them. And they went across the Black Sea to Constantinople and then moved on into Europe. And that's where the Black Death occurred sometime later. So over the entire time of that second pandemic, about 100 million deaths, just that 4 to 5 year period, a quarter of those, 25 million in just a few years. And this happened because there was an extremely rapid spread through Europe and Asia. And the story has always been, I taught it this way, every entomologist that's ever taught this has done so by talking about rats and fleas. Rats and fleas definitely started the pandemic, but they did not cause the Black Death. And so it's a little bit different story. I talk about Ray and him finding obscure references. As we were rewriting this about the Black Death, and Ray kept finding new references, and I'd have to rewrite the chapter again, and then he'd find another one, I'd rewrite again. I was just about ready to say, damn it, Ray, I don't want any more new references. And then he found the best reference in the entire book. And so I'm grateful I didn't lose my temper and say something to him. It helped that we were doing this by Zoom during our own pandemic. And so the impact, though, of the fleas caused the end of the Byzantine Empire. So the Byzantine Empire had been centered in Constantinople. The first pandemic hit Constantinople hard. About a third or half of the city was killed by the plague. The second pandemic went to Constantinople again decimating the city and really weakening the empire, the army supporting the empire, and that ended up being the end of that empire as they were taken over by others. Also led to the loss of absolute authority of two of the religions. Catholic Church, the church could not explain the plague and why it was happening. And Islam, Muhammad had promised that the plague would not enter the city of Medina, and it did. And so for a while, there was some questioning about the authority of Muhammad and his role in Islam. One thing, though, the plague led to the emergence of a middle class, and that is because of the deaths of so many workers. Those landowners had difficulty getting people to plant and harvest their crops, to rent their land, which was cause or the source of their income. And so as a result, those workers that survived were able to extract a little better wages and conditions, and so they were able to accumulate some money and buy their own land and become what we know as the middle class. Also, the beginnings of the Renaissance after the second pandemic, those wealthy patrons of the arts who were investing in artists and writers, architects, and so forth, sharing their wealth, leading to what was the Renaissance. So as a result of the impact of the fleas. However, the story of the Black Death needed to be changed, regardless of the impact of the pandemic, because fleas and rats started the pandemic, but the pace at which the pandemic moved through Europe and Asia was much faster than could occur by rats having to spread to humans, but they had to, the fleas had to return to the rats in order to breed. And so you have this generation and time occurring that was too slow for the spread of the plague through Europe. It wasn't fleas that spread it, and it certainly wasn't rats. Here we see a picture of Norway rat that's been blamed forever. Norway rats didn't get to Europe until 400 years after the pandemic, so it definitely wasn't them. And so what it was body lice. And the fleas and rats began the pandemic, but the spread of throughout Europe and Asia, where the disease was moving at the speed of humans. And it was because body lice were carrying this and spreading from one human to another. It also helps explain the sort of spotty infections that occurred. Not everybody was infected, but there were pockets, especially where there were families. And so the lice were the spread of the plague causing the Black Death. But lice have their own stories as well, because we've always had lice. Humans have been the host of lice forever. Head lice, body lice, pubic lice. And lice are just part of our language. We say, oh, I'm not coming to work today. I feel lousy. Well, these are lice is plural of louse, and you feel lousy because you were sickened by lice. Or you say, don't nitpick, or you call somebody a nitwit. and nits are the eggs of lice. And so these terms have become just part of our language. I don't use them every day, and hopefully you don't either, but they are part of our language. Well, okay, so what? Why do we care about lice? Well, lice also transmit typhus, and typhus is one nasty disease. Body lice live in clothing. They're different than head lice that live on the body, but body lice live in clothing. They move onto our body to feed and then retreat to the clothing. When they feed, they don't directly cause typhus, but where they feed, they defecate, and the bite that they cause by their piercing, sucking mouth part creates a reaction, and it itches. And as we scratch, we're inadvertently scratching the bacteria that are in their feces into the wound, and that's where an infection occurs. When I give this lecture in person, this is the point at which you look in the audience and about a third of the audience starts scratching. And so a little bit of discomfort for those in the audience. Well, typhus spreads, and it's in particular where there's crowding or the lack of hygiene, where people are thrown together, whether it's a natural disaster or human-caused disaster, typhus follows. In the middle 1700s, 1800s, there was something called jail fever, and this was typhus, and it spread among prisoners in England. At the time, England had some 240 crimes that were considered for capital punishment, and jail fever killed more than the executions for some 240 crimes. And so it passed among prisoners. It also spread at times from prisoners to the jailers, the sheriffs, and even judges, where clothing was intermingled, and the lice moved from the clothing of prisoners into the clothing of the sheriffs and the judges. So a bit ironic that a judge may have imparted a death sentence on a prisoner, but the prisoner may also have imparted a death sentence onto a judge. Especially where there have been wars. In the aftermath of wars, typhus has always been involved. World War I, millions died in Russia, and after the war, other places as well. But lice also spread a non-fatal disease called trench fever. And at the time, the British troops, because they all had lice, and they called lice by the name chats. And so they would try to delouse their clothing. They would find a common flame, whether it was a campfire or a candle or something. They would hold their uniform over this flame to try to kill the lice. And where they did this, in common, you see the picture of the three soldiers. These were called chat sessions. And so when you have a chat session with somebody else, whether online or however, you might consider where the term originated. World War II, in the ghettos, the camps, typhus was epidemic. Hundreds of thousands died. Anne Frank, the author, died of typhus. She and her sister Margot died of typhus in one of the camps. Also, before the camps, in the middle 1800s, the Irish famine, or the potato famine, was made worse by typhus. It wasn't started by it, but typhus really impacted the lower class of people the most difficult, or the most terribly. This is the group that was referred to as the unwashed masses. Those that were able to get away from Ireland emigrated to North America, inadvertently took typhus with them as well. They sailed on these ships that were never meant to hold people. They were often old timber ships, and people were crowded together below decks. You see in the image on the bottom left, below deck with at most a single hole through which light could come, crowded together. those that had typhus, and it was spread among others. No sanitation, little food, little water, so extremely dire conditions. And so these ended up being called coffin ships because so many on the ships died. The irony being that as they died, they were not given coffins, they were simply thrown overboard before they got to the destination. So in just a 2-year period, the immigrants going to Canada, some 20,000 of them died either in the coffin ships or when they landed in Canada. Those that were ill or showing any symptoms were moved into what were called fever sheds, where they were given some water and very minimal treatment. However, those that were treating them often were sickened and died as well. So a pretty dire situation caused by these lice. But what happened there because of lice? The importance of cleanliness and sanitation really became front and center. And the first public health program began in Germany as a result of typhus, trying to not just treat a disease, but treat those sickened and at a larger scale, in a community scale. And there was also a call for treating medicine like a social science, because in order to combat typhus, treating that disease also required treating poverty. Just treating the disease alone was insufficient. The fourth of the insects, how are we doing on time? I guess sort of okay. The yellow fever mosquito. Yellow fever was important in U.S. history, epidemics, the Spanish-American War, the Panama Canal, and slavery. And it was all because of sugar. Sugar was the reason that slaves were shipped to the Americas. The Portuguese began that trade, going first to Brazil and then to the Caribbean. And the numbers of slaves moved to work in sugarcane were horrifying. I had a chance to visit some of the slave castles in Ghana last fall, and it was quite sobering to think about. These slave ships, in addition to carrying the conscripted people, brought yellow fever mosquito and the virus to the Americas. Both the mosquito and the virus are native to Africa, not to the Americas. They came, the mosquitoes came as eggs in water barrels, and those that were infected by the virus. And the slaves then became the pool that infected subsequent people. Once yellow fever it is a plague, but yellow fever got to the New World, to the Caribbean, and then moved into the US. There were a number of epidemics of yellow fever early on in US history. 1793, so fairly soon after independence, when Philadelphia was the capital of the US, the epidemic of yellow fever killed some 10% of the population. People fled. George Washington fled just ahead of getting sick. Alexander Hamilton wasn't quite so quick and was sickened. He didn't die from it, but he was made sick, made ill by yellow fever. But nobody knew what caused it. There were some that thought it was bad air. And the word malaria, a different disease, mosquito-borne disease, comes from the Italian of bad air. And some thought it was that, or that the clothing of victims, whether they had blood on them or feces or anything like that from the victims, that was the spread. And it led to a plot during the Civil War. A doctor in Mississippi who hated everything to do with the North, and nothing symbolized the North more than President Abraham Lincoln. And so he collected clothing of yellow fever victims, packed them in trunks, and shipped them to various cities in the North. But one of those was to Washington, D.C., to a warehouse that was on Pennsylvania Avenue across the street from the White House. And he packed that crate with enough clothes. He thought it was so hot that it would kill at 100 yards, hoping to kill President Lincoln. Now, there's a bit of a lack of logic there, how he was able to pack these clothes in a trunk and not become ill, but yet Lincoln, 100 yards away, was supposed to be killed by them. So that's a little bit far-fetched. The other thing is he later, after being convicted of a crime and serving time, he later became the governor of Kentucky. So there is life after crazy crimes for some politicians. Important in the Spanish-American War, when the USS Maine exploded in February of 1898, captains were afraid of having their sailors that were injured going ashore to be treated in hospitals, which were very good, because they were afraid of yellow fever coming back onto the ships. The war was very short, only a couple months, the occupation a few years after that, but more than 13 times as many people died from yellow fever as from combat. One of those combatants, Theodore Roosevelt, was lieutenant colonel. We know him as the Rough Riders. The Rough Riders story, if you don't know, is a little bit far-fetched. When the troops were sent from Florida to Cuba, the Rough Riders, they only sent one horse. And so that one was the one that Roosevelt rode, and the other Rough Riders ended up being rough walkers, walking up the hills in San Juan and whatever the other hill next to it was. But Roosevelt recognized the concern of yellow fever, and so he insisted on his combat troops being returned to the U.S., not being occupation troops. And they had to be quarantined on the eastern end of Long Island for 6 weeks to make sure they weren't sick. But what happened, Major Walter Reed, you know the name, was the chair of a yellow fever commission, and they, through some elegant experiments, showed that the fever was spread by a mosquito. It was not accepted when he came out with this idea. Most of the medical community thought he was mad. But the military did accept it, and a Major William Crawford Gorgas, who was the sanitation officer in Havana during the occupation, created a plan to get rid of yellow fever in Havana. It was quite an elaborate plan, but it worked, and they rid the capital city of yellow fever, and thus the remaining occupation was safe for those staying there. While this was going on, there had been efforts to try to create a canal across the Isthmus of Panama. The French had tried this, abandoned the project because of so many deaths and the difficulty of it. And so in 1902, the US took over this. And during that year, some quarter of all the workers deserted because they were afraid they could see their fellow workers being sickened by yellow fever, also malaria, but yellow fever being the more frightening. And so William Crawford Gorgas took the plan that he had implemented in Havana, took it to Panama, and was successful in eliminating yellow fever from the canal zone around in Panama. And thus the canal was able to be completed. And so slavery was definitely made worse because of yellow fever and the mosquito, because slaves were dying from yellow fever, so that meant they had to import more of them. And so it was an endless cycle, yellow fever having a major impact on that. Affected the outcome of the war and other wars, but by defeating yellow fever and the mosquito, the Panama Canal was completed. As a result, the US was able to become a global power because the canal allowed the US to have a global navy, both in the Atlantic and the Pacific. Okay, last of the insects, honeybee, and you folks know more about honeybees than I ever will. I apologize for that. You know, they were brought to America in the early 1600s, because the settlers from Europe brought crop plants and they weren't being adequately pollinated. And so they brought the honeybee with them in order to provide pollination. And so the topics of beekeeping, honey production, the value of bees, you all know more than I do. And so I'm not going to talk about that part. What I am going to talk about is maybe some things about honeybee that you know less about. So why do we need bees? And then I'll talk about bees in history. Well, why do we need bees? Because plants have sex too. But nobody told HBO, or the series would have been very different than it was. Plant reproduction is all it amounts to is transferring male gametes to a female structure on a plant, on a flower, and it's done by something called pollen. And this is the structure that allows transporting and delivering male gametes. And pollen is, there are many unique structures, vary in size from 7 microns to about 700, varied shapes and colors. This image that is just spectacularly beautiful, different kinds of pollen. And pollen has to be transported for reproduction to occur from male to female flowers. And there are 2 kinds of transfer. The first of these is abiotic, meaning it's not having to do with living things. It's done by the wind. And this is called a nemophilic pollen. And so the pollen that's spread by the wind is very lightweight. It's either extremely small, and you see some pollen here relative to the size of a dime, either very small or it has a winged shape to it. And if you're allergic to pollen, it's probably from wind-pollinated flowers. So things like grass or pine, corn, ragweeds, those are small, lightweight, wind distributed pollen. And the plants that produce wind-pollinated or that are wind-pollinated produce pollen that has almost no investment in it. Instead, they produce a lot of it. And so the flowers that are wind-pollinated don't contain nectar. This pollen that is carried by the wind is not at all nutritious. The other sort of pollination is biotic. And so that's done by animals and primarily insects. So it's referred to as entomophilic. Entomo being insect, philic being loving. So insect loving pollen. And how this occurs, this is largely flowering plants, the angiosperms, and the fruit plants, ornamental plants, most of the fruit that we eat. And so these plants evolved some 130 million years ago, a little bit before the bees, but coevolution with especially with the bees over the last 100 million years. Well, how do bees find plants and how do they get pollen? Bees see a different range of light than we do, and they see very well at short or ultraviolet wavelengths, much better than we do. And so plants look different to bees, and many of them have what are called pollen guides, and allows it sort of is an arrow to the pollen that shows the bees where to get that. And flowers produce a number of enticements, heavy pollen that's nutritious for the insects, and they produce nectar. And if you're thinking about this sort of pollination, the perspective matters. If you're a botanist, insects just move the pollen in order to make plants. And any nectar is what I would call a social lubricant that enhances pollination. That's a botanist perspective. Of course, the correct perspective, that of an entomologist, is that pollen and nectar were made for insects, and flowers are just eye candy. They just attract the insects, and pollination is only a byproduct. What matters is the pollen and nectar that insects get from that act. That's the correct perspective we know.
Yeah.
Well, who are the major pollinators? As I said, primarily bees, solitary bees, but especially social bees like honeybees. Long history. Most of our crops, as I said, originated in Europe and Western Asia, and the bees originated there, and they were moved along the Silk Roads, both in multiple directions from their origin in Asia. That part you know. Some parts you may not know. A wonderful book, reads like a novel, by Jeff Lockwood at the University of Wyoming, book called Six-Legged Soldiers. Absolutely recommend this book. Subtitle is Using Insects as Weapons of War. And another way that bees were considered as weapons, Cassius Clay with his statement, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. However, he didn't realize that honeybees could only sting once. And so unless he planned on just one punch being enough to knock out his opponents, we'll cut him a little slack. There's no evidence that he took any entomology classes in his youth. But bees were not metaphorical. They were used as weapons, bees and wasps. And they were, because people figured out they could be used as a weapon. And they were using what occurred naturally, the social bees and wasps. Well, why social insects? Because of this thing. The stinger, the venom that goes with that. And so social insects being in large numbers, very fiercely protective and armed with a stinger and with venom. Naturally available, they were ready to use right off the shelf. Some time ago, Pliny the Elder, don't know why Pliny the Elder, not the younger, but Pliny the Elder came up with this statement that it took 27 hornet stings to be fatal. We don't know how he came up with that, whether there was some experiment or why it was 27 and not 26 or 28. Nonetheless, that's what he said. But bees and wasps certainly cause physical harm, but also psychological harm, panic to the enemies when bees were used. And the use of them went way back. Some areas that are known, this Mithridatic War in what's now Turkey, Eupatoria, a town where the Romans laid siege. They dug tunnels under the walls so they could get access to the city. The emperor and his folks released bees, they were probably hornets, in the tunnels, and the Romans then fled and gave up on that idea after being stung. Mithridates also moved across Turkey, and when doing so, he had his troops place containers of honey along the route as if they were discarded. Well, the honey came from bees that had visited rhododendrons, and you probably know that honey from rhododendrons is not good. It would cause sickening. And so the Romans that were following found this discarded honey as a spoil of war and ate the honey, were poisoned, were sickened by this, and then the followers of Mithridates were able to defeat them. Beehives also used defending castles. Up on the skeps were put on the parapets. Hives were dropped onto invaders like boiling oil or boiling water. Again, this much like a Monty Python, it sounds like dropping beehives onto people. But many of the castles were constructed, they had recesses on the south walls, and they were used to put a skep in there to hold the beehive. But throwing bees, as you might imagine, had some sort of issues. I would not have been one of those wanting to do that. So the improvement in using bees came from developing catapults and trebuchets, and to use them to bombard an enemy. The word bombard comes from the Greek word bombos and later the Latin word bombus. And you probably know that bombus is the genus of bumblebees. Whether they were throwing honeybees or bumblebees doesn't matter. But the word came from the same root that we use for bees now. The catapult or trebuchet could bombard a castle. It could throw things a whole lot further and a whole lot safer than by throwing it by by an individual. During the Crusades, Richard I left Europe with 200 ships, and apparently 13 of those carried beehives to use as ammunition in the battle. And during the siege in 1191, catapulted beehives over the walls into the city. So some 800 years later, it wasn't just an ancient thing. They were still used in 20th century wars. In World War I, using tripwires, the Germans connected ropes to hives of honeybees dropping onto advancing British troops. There are a couple different versions of the story, but one that seems to be the most credible is that that's how the Germans stopped and won this battle of the bees in East Africa. But not just in World War I, as late as Vietnam, where the Vietnamese made bee booby traps, and they were effective against US tanks because the protection that tanks had, the armor and everything on the outside, was against ammunition, not against bees. And so these trip lines connected to the nests of Apis dorsata, which is the large Asian honeybee, large and aggressive. And so when the hives were dropped onto a tank, the bees were not real happy, and they could get into a tank, and one would imagine that it wouldn't end well. You wouldn't want to be in a closed container with a lot of angry bees. So the bees, important in pollination, and as pollinators, use the impact that they have on our diet, food production, immense, and then some of the use of them as weapons throughout history. What I want to do to finish, and this will be just fairly quick, but a connection, and this is connecting silk to you and why I began with silk. And so ancient silk was woven using looms like this that were operated by hand for thousands of years until the jacquard loom, first demonstrated in 1801, and this allowed repeated patterns, making large-scale weaving, making many of the same sort of outcome, inexpensive, and so allowed for quick weaving. But this loom was used wooden punch cards that were tied together, and they had holes punched in them. And when they passed through this loom, rods that had hooks at the end would drop through them and pull thread back up. And that's what allowed creating the patterns in the woven objects. Great idea, and it's worked for many years. But the idea was also picked up by a guy named Herman Hollerith in the US, who was hired to oversee the census in 1890. And he demonstrated its validity on the 1880 census. It was as accurate as counting by hand. And so he adapted this jacquard card of wooden cards put together and made paper cards that could allow collecting and counting the census data. And the way this did, there were holes that were punched in the cards, and those corresponded to specific census data. These were fed into a machine that he invented, where the holes passed through electric wires as charge, transmitted a signal, and he invented a tabulating machine that collected those data and tabulated the data for the census. A great idea. He founded a machine company out of this, a tabulating machine company, worked for many years. It later, some 20 years later, merged with 3 other companies, and they changed the name of the company to the International Business Machines Company. You've probably heard of that company itself, making tabulating machines, large computers, personal computers, and leading to the cell phones that probably some of you are on right now. And so this connection from the silkworm to creating silk, to early weaving, to the jacquard loom, the tabulating machine coming from that, IBM making personal computers, to the smartphone. So next time somebody asks you what insects ever did for you, just show them your cell phone. With that, I'll quit. I would give that talk in my class, I'd say, and so for those of you that are on your cell phone now, rather than listening to me, that's what they did for you. I don't know, Nicole, if there's any time for questions, or if there
Yes,
were,
we do have.
yeah, I apologize. I sort of forgot about those.
No, it was a great presentation. Thank you very much. Do we have any questions here from Rob? For Rob?
Can you hear?
Come close, right here.
Thank you, Dr. Wiedenmann. Fascinating. My question was, what was the big bug that got omitted that you got the B in favor of?
Yeah, well, Ray wanted the fruit fly because of its impact on genetics and everything that's happened as a result of understanding genetics. And so if we had a sixth one, then Ray was voting for that one. My sixth insect was going to be boll weevil, because I think boll weevil was largely responsible for the development of rock and roll music. So again, no fist fights, no bloodshed, because our publisher limited us to 5 and not 6.
I have a question. You said that air pollinated pollen was totally worthless. How come bees like corn pollen so well?
I don't know the answer to that, but they're certainly not getting, I mean, for one thing, there's a lot of it, but there's very little nutrition in it. And so I suppose it might be like eating popcorn. There's not much nutrition in any one kernel of popcorn, but you eat a lot of it. It may be that, but they're certainly not getting much out of any individual pollen grain from corn.
Yes. You want to come up?
I'll just say that. I can speak to that because I studied pollination in college.
Can you speak a little louder?
I can't hear him, sorry.
Yeah, I studied pollination in college. My name's Evan, so I can speak to that question about corn pollen. It's a really interesting one. So those of you who've been keeping bees for a while, you've probably seen your bees foraging on corn. And it helps to understand that by explaining that when pollinated pollen is full of starch, it's very starchy, so it can be light. Starch is a molecule that's kind of light. Insect collected pollen typically has a lot of lipids, a lot of oil. That's much more nutritious for them. My hypothesis is, and I think it's true, is that corn pollen has slightly more oil. It's just more nutritious for the bees, in addition to being very abundant. So you will at times see them foraging on corn pollen. Makes sense.
Yeah, and it would depend at times on what's available, and certainly in many areas where there are enormous areas occupied by corn. But one of our students, when I was at Arkansas, looked at what bees were getting, and sometimes they were traveling long distances over many of these crops to get pollen from maple trees, even though the maples were far away and fewer in number than the crop plants that were pollinating much closer to the hives.
I just had a quick footnote on your boll weevil. There's a statue to the boll weevil. It's either in Enterprise or Valdosta, Alabama.
Enterprise.
Enterprise. I didn't know if you knew that, but it's because they didn't want to have a statue to a black man, so they made it to the boll weevil. Black man was who said try cotton instead of or peanuts instead of cotton, because the cotton was devastated. Yeah, and the cotton crops were devastated by boll weevil. The large-scale emigration of poor farmers who lost their farms as a result of boll weevil moved north. And my idea is it's not just mine. They stopped in a place called Memphis, where the old Delta blues were combined with hillbilly country music, and you've got the creation of Elvis, bigger in Dallas, bigger in Memphis, I guess. There you go.
We've got another question back here. If you could speak loud.
Actually, no.
Oh, okay. You're waiting. Anybody else have a question? I have one question, which is why do you think the honeybee wasn't, or was it traded on the Silk Road?
I don't know that it probably was traded, but it was certainly transported. But from sort of Southeast Asia, the origin, so along the Silk Roads. I don't know how much it would have been traded. I'm sure it was because it would have been a valuable thing to whoever got it, but moved along those routes for quite a while.
How did I get to North America?
So there's a question of how did the honeybee get to North America?
I believe it was brought by the European colonists that came over in the early 1600s. That's the story I'm aware of.
It was the primaries in Germany, and then but they were a mean bee. And they brought the ones from Italy.
From Germany and Italy? Do you have a question or?
What do we know about mites? And how did we get rid of them?
Oh, her question was, now that we've got mites from Asia, and they came over with importation of honeybees. Are there any insects to help us, or what can we do about the mites here? Any suggestions?
Oh boy, I'm not the one to answer that, but yeah, those the larger bees in Asia were able to tolerate the mites a bit better than the smaller European honeybee, and they evolved with those. They had ways, I guess, of cleaning themselves or grooming themselves, but we don't see that in the European bee. I don't know a solution to that, though. I'm sorry. If I did, I could have retired far earlier than I did.
Oh, well, thank you very much. We thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. Any last questions or comments? All right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Take care.
And we're just going to end the last 15 minutes or so with club-related information. So you're welcome to stay on, or you're welcome to take your leave.
I think I will leave. I've got several people that are anxious to have dinner here and are waiting on me. So I'm the only thing standing between them and dinner. I better stop. Thank
All
you.
right. Thank
Bye.
you. Good night.
Bye.
That's okay.
Bigger than mine.
Okay, so I need to share screen. All right, so Brianna de la Cruz, she had to cancel last month, but she will give her presentation in May. So we're very excited for to hear her presentation. We need help. We need help. We need help. We need help with updating and revamping our state fair booth because it's boring. We have the large observation hive, which is interesting. And we'll have, we're going to try to make sure that the queen is marked with some color other than red, so it's easier to see. We're going to have a smaller observation hive that we either will provide or the state fair will provide. We have a photo booth with props for people to take pictures. We have some coloring pages, but it's really just for younger children. So we want to have something about varroa mites. So 3D model of the mite. What does it look like? What does it look like when you on a sticky board, for example? How do people make, how do they look for deformed wing virus? Information about how to combat varroa mites We had a lot of requests for native plant and native pollinator, and that would require putting together displays, either bringing in live plants, people who either have live or specimens of different native bees. Would be interesting to look at those. We've got access to a dissecting scope and a regular microscope where we could look at, look at bee parts, bee bodies. I mean, the bodies are beautiful. The wings are incredible to look at. So we want to try to make things more hands-on. Be nice also to have more information displays about where all the contaminants come from, because most of the contaminants that negatively impact all wildlife comes from residential use. Because anybody without any licensure or information, educational background can use lots and lots of chemicals that are forever chemicals, and not only contaminate your own yard, but contaminate the environment. So we want to, we also had a suggestion for doing an online quiz. Kahoot is something a lot of K through 12 classrooms use. It's fun. Yeah, you've done Kahoot. And so we could set that up where they have a QR code and questions, and they can, as they're going through our booth and our tables, gather some real useful information rather than, oh, I saw a bunch of bees. But we need help. We need people who know how to design stuff and make it look attractive, who've got ideas about how to physically build displays. So Julie had at the beginning.
Where's the sign-up sheet? We sent a sign-up sheet around for 3 volunteer opportunities at the beginning of the meeting. Okay, if it hasn't been all the way around the room, have you guys all seen those 3 volunteer sheets? Okay, just pass that back up to the front so we don't lose track of that.
So anyway, we've got a committee. We just don't have enough of us. And so there's 4 of us, and but really most of it will be me and Walt, unless we have your support. And if it's just me and Walt, nothing's going to happen because we've got so much to do right now. So anyway, that's my plug. Yes.
You're Adam. Yeah, I'm Julie. It's nice meeting you.
Wonderful. Did you put your name down?
I didn't.
Yeah, I'm his.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. Appreciate it. Oh, wonderful. Super. It's great. We've got like 92 members now. But about 50 of them didn't fill out the membership form. And it's very labor intensive for me to fill out this membership form for you and track you down and get your information, or for Michael to track you down, charge a fine. So fill out the form. If you don't like any of the online stuff, you can do it in cash. Right, exactly. And we're still trying to get our Instagram up and running. So if you've got pictures, you got videos, send them to us and we'll get them posted. And if you are still in need of a mentor, I remind you to contact Jen Hine. And always register your hive with the state. That way, when something goes south, they will notify you because they know you have hives. The online system is kind of a circus right now. So my suggestion is you just email Janae and she will take your information, type it into the system, and you don't have to deal with the internet stuff.
You send your slide on to
Send my what?
send this group of slides
Oh, sure,
to the email recipient. That way we have those links.
sure. Or you can take a picture, but yes, I can also email it. And we're still working on getting all of these videos uploaded to YouTube, but we don't have a volunteer for that. So if you know how to do these things, come talk to me or Walt or Julie. We've got some events coming up, and that's what I think the the sheets were that were being passed around. We have the Ladybug Festival on Saturday, May 18th. Bug Fest is coming up in August, and then the state fair is for 10 days. So those are our big events. And then our private event will be the fall banquet. All right, so do you want to come here? These are your slides next. Here you go.
Is this one hooked up?
I didn't have time because of all the other issues. But, oh, I don't have USB.
Okay.
anymore.
Not gonna bring it home.
All right. Well, I'll just sit here and press enter. Okay, just gonna go through different scenarios of, this one's just if you're lucky enough to have a hive overwintered. It's
Allow. Okay, you know what?
No.
to be on the board next year, you'll have to know IT better than we do.
All right, it's not gonna
No,
work.
It worked.
Oh, it worked.
Okay. So if you have an overwintered hive, check that the queen's alive. And personally, I don't like searching for the queen. Takes a long time and the odds of hurting her are so great. I personally just look for eggs. And anybody that was out there before when we were doing the hives, poor little Andrew got stung.
You got to see some eggs on.
He got to see a stinger or two. I have a magnifying glass. It's just like one of them you use to read books with. That I just keep there because my eyes don't work that good, and see the queen cells. I mean the eggs.
And if you don't see eggs at this time, then that might mean that you have virgin queen.
Right.
So don't freak out.
Don't freak out. In fact, I've got it in here. Don't freak out. Okay. If you have capped brood, larva, no queen cells, you're probably just fine. Make sure the brood's in a good pattern. Has larva that looks pearly white and wet. If it's brown, then you got to worry about European foul brood. Yeah, not American.
Yellow laying on the side of it.
Yep.
Sticky stringy Western.
Okay, so you want a nice little white pearly one there. Look for pollen, honey stores, and that the hive is growing each time you inspect it. Of course, when 8 frames are full, then we need to do something. You need to add a box to it, give them more space. Because you don't want them to swarm on you, so. Feed them syrup this time of year. Now, some people don't feed them. That's up to whatever you prefer. I like feeding mine. We do 1-to-1 ratio. Helps them to build wax and honey stores. We feed 1-to-1 in the spring to emulate nectar, 2-to-1 in the fall to emulate the honey. And apply mite treatment. Anybody needs oxalic acid pads? Talk to Jerry.
Can I say something real quick about applied mite treatment? And I talked to Peter and also the state bee inspector this week. Because the bees have gotten going so quickly this year and are swarming already in mid-April, we are gonna have a massive mite problem come May and June, much earlier than we normally see mites in the hives explode. And so even if you can, there's things you can treat with honey supers on, so if you've already added some honey supers or whatever, just use the right treatment, but you need to be treating your bees for mites right now if you want them to make it through the summer. Peter's very, very concerned about how many bees are swarming and how many people's colonies have made it through winter. And he asked me to just really emphasize tonight, like, get in there and treat your colonies for mites.
So good. Are you just treating them now? I mean, do you treat them out of your route anyway?
So you should test, and do a count. Lots of people don't, so, we advocate for testing. But you can put the, oxalic acid sponges on your hive. And they're pretty mild. I don't know that I would treat with something like Formic Pro or something that's harsh on your queen and your larvae without doing a test. Because I think you're putting your queen and your larvae at risk. But, the oxalic acid vapor and the oxalic acid sponges, you can monitor by your drop, your mite drop on a sticky board. And, but the big thing is you just need to be aware. How you decide to treat for your mites and test for your mites is up to you. On our Facebook page at the top under featured, where you have to join the club and some of the other things are, if you scroll over, there's a Varroa mite. What's the name of that?
Varroa mite tool.
Yeah, it's a Varroa mite tool, and it has
Mite tool
tons
that
of
you can
information on testing, counting, treating for mice.
And you want to vary your treatments. You can't use oxalic the whole time. You gotta give some breaks for your queen, because those acids are hard on the bees. They just don't kill them like outright like they do the mites. So you want to vary the treatment depending upon the temperature and whether or not you have honey supers. You can use physical or some people call it a cultural control, where you get rid of drone cells. Like all the hives that I've been into, they're loaded with drone cells. Get rid of them, because that's where you're going to find most of your mites. That's one way. You got brood breaks. You lose your queen, you let them raise a new one, you're gonna have a long enough period of time where the mite load is gonna go down close to zero. It probably won't reach totally zero, but it will be close. And that's another way to bring down the mite load. But you wanna make sure you vary it, right? Because we've heard this story over and over again. You hit something with the same chemical over and over again, you're naturally gonna be selecting for those individuals that are genetically able to better handle it. And then they're the ones that are gonna have babies, and then your problem gets even worse, right? So integrated pest management is, I guess, the
Yeah.
catchphrase.
One way, if you don't want to do a mite wash and kill bees in a mite wash, or you don't want to do a sugar shake, which isn't a super, but you can get in your hive and just pluck some of your drone cells and look at your drones, and they'll have, if you've got mites on your drone larvae, then you've got a mite problem in your hive.
You've got a very big mite
Yeah.
problem in your hive.
Yeah.
It's
So-
not like a little problem, it's a big problem.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Sorry to interrupt.
No problem. So see Jerry. He's got pad sponges out in his car, truck.
When you say,
Sure.
when you do an inspection of your hive, how extensive is that going to be? Do you take every frame out and look at it? Top super, bottom super, or?
I don't. Now, some people do. But I think I'm gonna get into
So
it
you'll-
here.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah,
Every time you open your hive, you have a goal in mind, and that's what you're looking at. So like right now is pick them up, you see eggs,
yeah,
you're done.
You're
Okay,
done.
go back here and get
Yeah.
out of it.
Yeah.
Stop messing.
I would say another thing you wanna do now is swarm season. Got 2 boxes, break them apart, just lift it up, you keep the front of the box right where it is, lift the back of the box up. And look at the bottom of those frames to see if you've got swarm cells.
Yep.
If you got swarm cells, then you've gotta do it. I had that happen last week. Went in, found the queen, put her in another box, I false swarmed them, I'm hoping to be able to prevent that. So that, I think, right now is probably job number 1, is to
Yes.
just see if you've got swarm cells at the bottom of the top box. 90% of them are gonna be there.
Not the bottom box.
No,
not this time.
Between
Should be
the
at the
top
top.
and second, that they can be elsewhere, but 90%. And then, like you say, I go in, I just check, if I got eggs.
Yep.
Yeah, well, the other thing you do when you crack those boxes is look at the number of bees on the top frames of that bottom box. Then you put it back down, you see the number of bees you got on the top box, and that's gonna tell you if you need to split or if it's time to put supers on. And then you go into that, you try to have a lot of box, but just look at a few frames, and if you've got eggs and a nice laying pattern, Bye-bye.
And right now, there must be a nectar flow on, because I've got hives over at Westminster, and they are packing the nectar into that bottom box. So I'm gonna have to get in there and rearrange and put some empty frames in the bottom, and then put some honey supers on them right away. So that's just this area around here, but I'm sure if it's this area, it's other areas too, just not my house in Draper.
The swarm that we did yesterday,
Mhm.
overnight, they filled out 3 or 4 frames and 5 frames
Yeah,
overnight.
yeah, that's the cool thing about swarms. So if you need drawn
They had a
comb
bunch in.
and you catch a swarm, they'll draw out comb. Don't ever put a swarm on, well, you can, but I would checkerboard them on existing comb. Give them empty frames, because they want to build comb. That's, they swarm and they've stored up, resources so they can build comb. So when you get a swarm, put them on a box that has either every other frame is empty, but don't put them on a box that's just nothing but comb, because it doesn't give them really anything to do. Okay, sorry, well.
You're good. Jerry?
If you find swarm cells and you cut the swarm cells off, it's like if you have a rock in your shoe and you keep taking aspirin to make it better. You gotta make a change. You gotta take that stimulus away. So you have to do a divide, or you have to do something on it, because they'll just build more swarm cells in the state while you just cut them out. And they will even, if you cut them out, sometimes they'll even swarm when you cut them out. Yeah. The hive saying we're going, and that queen will still go, so again, a split, the way I find it is I try to find the queen and I put her in a different box. Because now we don't have a queen, and the bees with the queen are saying, oh, we're somewhere else, and that's one of the quickest, easiest ways to do it. The other thing I'll mention here this time, because they're filling out so fast, don't only just look at bees when you're looking at it, look at your frames and see if there's room for laying. Because if she's plugged out, if there's brood everywhere, and if there's honey and pollen everywhere, that swarm is gonna swarm. If I've got that going on, I'm gonna pull a couple of frames out that are full of honey or something else, and I'm gonna throw frames in that just have wax, so that the bees are gonna be coming in and laying, and that's gonna help reduce the urgency of the swarm.
Okay, next item is have a water source, be a good neighbor. Be nice to your bees, don't make them go to the neighbor's swimming pool. Have a water source. I built a little pond.
Tell me to do something about it, but I don't like that.
I built a little pond. I put lily pads in it. It's amazing how many bees I've got sitting on that. They're just hundreds of them that'll
Does it
sit.
have to be still water?
Mine's a waterfall.
So,
But they want something, they'll drown if they're not like a wasp. They can't land on water. So they need something to sit on, but they'll go along the edge or just sit on the little lily pads and drink. And I've also, you can just
Right around.
have something with just rocks in it and water, just something they can stand on and get a drink.
Strong.
What's that?
Don't put it next to the hive.
No, don't, yeah,
it's right next to the canal, does that work?
Yeah.
yeah. Oh, yeah.
If the water got
Nope.
lots more in there.
Yeah, Andrew's got a canal near his house, which is perfect for him. Andrew's also got a nursery right behind his house.
Oh, nice.
So his bees are just happy as can be. Okay, how to find eggs. Had a different picture, but we didn't get this updated. But if your eyes are good, it's not an issue. I can't see them 90% of the time. Look for the white egg in the bottom of the honeycomb cells, like we talked about out there. It's gonna be a little bee smaller than a grain of rice. They're laying on the side, that's probably workers laying them, so it'll be in the bottom. Use the sunlight, just hold up the frame, have the sun hitting it. If it's a cloudy day, use a flashlight. What I use is my cell phone. Take your cell phone, take a picture, then you can expand it and look at it. I posted some, if you look on our Facebook page, I posted some that I took this week. Take photos, videos at different distances, then you can enlarge them and find the eggs after the inspection. Of course, that's gonna be near the center of the box in the brood box area. Be aware if the frames are full, like this gentleman talked about, of cap brood, there's nowhere for the queen to lay eggs. Keep that in mind. She's gotta have room. It's gotta be built cone. It's gotta be deep enough for her. If it's not deep enough and built up enough, she won't lay an egg in it. So if you don't see eggs, don't panic. Wait 4 or 5 days, as Nick said, and see if it's just a new queen that hasn't started laying yet.
Scared to see 2 or 3 eggs in a cell doesn't necessarily mean you have a laying worker. That just means you have an over-excited new queen.
She's just new and just doesn't know what to do yet. Yeah.
So how long does it take for a queen to mature?
5 days.
5 days
Is that all?
Not for,
after she's mated.
5 days of hardening, that she can breed during that time, and that she doesn't breed during that time. There's 10 days, 2, yeah.
And then she'll leave.
So 2 weeks from the time that she hatches.
2 weeks.
So she's gonna take a mating flight. The drones, she doesn't mate with the drones normally in her hive. And so they're in a tree or wherever. It's like when us old guys go to McDonald's and sit around and solve world problems, that's what the drones do. They're sitting in a tree just waiting around. They're,
The bees don't read the same books we do.
yeah. Bees don't read books. Yeah, I saw that shirt. I want that shirt. Okay, is my hive planning to swarm? Are the boxes full? Like Julie had at Westminster, where you open the lid and they just kind of pour out everywhere? Are there? Yeah, I know. How horrible, huh? Are there swarm cells? If you have queen cups with nothing in them, it's not really a problem. If you've got queen cells with something in it, then they're either replacing the queen because the pheromones coming off of her, or saying there's something wrong with her, or they're planning to swarm. If they've already made swarm cells, you need to split the hive, like Jerry said. They've already made up their mind, they're wanting to do something. So you need to help them with it.
How can you identify a swarm cell as opposed to just the queen cells?
The queen cup has nothing in it. The queen cell, you'll see the white in there.
Okay.
You'll see it's gonna be, their larva or,
So-
and the
so
royal
they may
jelly.
make a queen cell that isn't used yet.
Right.
Yeah.
And the swarm
Yeah.
cells are usually along the bottom, but it's up on the middle of the frame, and that might be a supersede cell, where the queen is failing, and they want to replace her. If you take that out, you don't have any swarm cells, but you do have a supersede cell, and if you take the supersede cell out, you're in trouble. Yeah.
Or you're adding a queen. Yeah. And like we talked about out there, the queen cells are gonna be on the bottom pointing down, drones are gonna be pointing to the side. If no swarm cells, you can add a box. Is your hive ready to split? Can you get a queen? The commercial beekeepers have queens. Richard Homer's got a bunch. I don't know if David Bench does, but there's a bunch out there right now.
Yep.
Look for the swarm cells. Make sure your hive has 6 frames of brood, some honey, and 1 to 1.5 boxes of bees. If you're going to do a split, keep at least 3 frames of brood in each box for the split. Keep the same amount. You don't want to starve the ones you're leaving behind, so leave them some. Make sure the queen is in the bottom box. If you don't see her, shake all the bees into the bottom box, put on a queen excluder. So basically you pull off the top box, you have an empty box there, put it on top of your bottom one, pull the frames one at a time, shake all the bees in there. So that way the queen hopefully is in the bottom. Then put a queen excluder on, put that box on, and let it sit 4 to 5 hours. Those bees are going to come up through the queen excluder and start taking care of the brood that's there. And then at night, you can pull that off to make your split add a queen to it. So after dark, take the top box and add a new queen. Okay, taking care of your new split, install a new queen within 12 to 24 hours, feed within 24 hours. Check to see that the queen's been released and starting to lay 3 or 4 days. Some people say leave the cork in there if the cork's sideways on a queen cage. I don't like that. It takes a long time, seems like, for them to eat that. So what Richard does, he's got little candy tubes. It's basically a little tube with sugar in it. Stick that in, leave it sticking out so it kind of looks like a queen cell. And they'll eat that sugar and get to the queen.
But if you've got a cork, leave the cork in a couple of days and then just put a marshmallow.
Yeah, you can do that too.
Because you want that queen there for a good 3
Yeah,
days.
you don't want to, don't put a marshmallow in a brand new queen and put it in there because they'll eat that same night or same day.
Killer, yeah.
And then they'll kill her. So they would need a couple of days to get used to her smell and everything so they don't kill her. Feed the syrup. You know, like we talked about, depending on the strength of the hive and the weather, they may drink 1 cup to 1 gallon per day. So keep an eye on it. Let's see. Okay, if you give them, it's normally in springtime, we don't overfeed, but if you give them too much sugar water, they'll end up filling up the brood nest, and you'll see too much in their liquid where there's no place for the queen to lay. And that's more likely to happen in the winter, you know, in the fall when we're feeding them. But be aware of that you're not overfeeding them. Just kind of check them periodically, make sure there's places for her to lay. Middle 4 to 5 frames should have 2/3 of the frame open for her to lay in. And continue feeding and add honey supers. Once you add honey supers, don't feed anymore at that point, unless you want sugar honey. So, okay. Want to do a quick special thanks to David Bench. He gave us 2 packages for our youth beekeeper program. This is this gentleman back here.
They're giving you pictures of us.
Yeah. So he learned how to light the smoker. We were out there doing the bees. About 3 kids walked by. They were really tough till they got stung by a bee. They took off running, so me and Andrew got to just sit there and kind of giggle. So,
I took Belle to catch a swarm 2 Sunday nights ago
Like first day
in
into
the
it.
rain in Sandy, and it was like 30 feet up in the tree, and we had a bucket and a pole, and the swarm was wider than the bucket. So when we banged the swarm, bees rained down on her head, and she only had bees like less than 24 hours. Oh, was it 3 days? Okay, so I traumatized her a little bit, but she did great. I was so proud of her.
Oh, wonderful. All right, well, that is it unless you've got any other, and this slide here is just some videos. Rosemary Bennett introduced me to the bush bee man. He's pretty funny. He's from Australia. And, but his videos are very clear, easy to follow. So if you're nervous about splitting your hive, I recommend taking a look at this. You guys have any questions? No? All right. Well, that adjourns our meeting. Thank you, everyone, for joining us online.